Hey there, friends. This is Pastor Paul Carter from Cornerstone Baptist Church in Aurelia. I'm the host of the Inn of the Word podcast and one of the facilitators of the Canadian Pastors Forum. And this is the podcast version of that forum where we discuss issues of interest to the Canadian church. Today, I'm talking with two of my very good friends and colleagues in ministry, Pastor Paul Martin from Grace Fellowship Church in Toronto and Pastor Stephen Bray from Calvary Baptist Church in St. John's, Newfoundland. So, brothers, welcome to the program.
Great to be here, brother. Great to be with you.
Good to be with you, buddy.
Yeah, our topic for today is church revitalization versus church planting. And I imagine that all three of us are going to agree right off the top that these are both good tools. These are both good strategies that we're going to need in the church here in Canada. But my main interest today is to help churches figure out which of those tools is going to be better for them in whatever situation they're faced with. So, Paul, why don't we start with you? We'll get to it right off the bat. Tell us what you're doing in Toronto and tell us how you landed on that tool and that approach as the right tool for you in that situation.
First of all, I'd like to express my disappointment. I saw verses in the title, and I thought this was going to be kind of a takedown. Like I got to take down Bray, like WWE pastors.
We can do that. We can pivot.
I'm not worried about you. You're concussed, man. You'd be an easy fight right now.
I'm all better now. Yeah, so we've done both in Toronto, including us. We've planted 4 churches over the last 25 years, and then we have helped to revitalize, I'll say 2.5. One was a little bit on the sly, which is kind of how we stumbled into.
They didn't know you were revitalizing them?
Well, in a sense, no. We had no official capacity, but we were big cheerleaders and assistants to the pastor, young pastor who went into that church, who had no other elders. And just, we supplied help in the ways that we could. Mm-hmm. So the chronology of that for us is that we began with planting. We planted, then we planted some more, and then realized, hey, none of us have buildings of our own.
Yeah.
The likelihood that we're going to get a building is very small, especially if you grow to a certain size. So if you're over 30 people, it becomes increasingly difficult. Then you got the problem of schools and other, typical rental places that are maybe getting a little more progressive toward the left, not wanting any kind of gospel preaching in their buildings. And so a lot of churches in the city that were planted, they actually end up over 10 years, if they last, they leave because they can't find anywhere to meet.
Yeah.
So our strategy was, hey, there's a bunch of church buildings that are getting turned into condos, and they may be costly in their own way, depending on the structure and the state of its repair. But why not help revitalize those existing places and keep a gospel witness in those neighborhoods? So that's how we pivoted to revitalization. And we just think it's a better, just on a very pragmatic level, we think that's a much better strategy than trying to plant churches in Toronto.
Okay. All right, Stephen, same question to you. You're out there in St. John, Newfoundland. It's obviously a different context than Toronto, but you've kind of really leaned into church planting. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing and why you thought that was the right model for you out there.
Yeah, again, same gospel, same commission, just different set of circumstances, which drives, what your priorities are. So I live in a world where there are not a lot of churches. There are a lot of, what I would call established religion that's very embedded into our culture. Irony of ironies, we actually were able to purchase one of those buildings, which is a miracle story in and of itself, but largely we have not been able to get access to buildings. And nor are those churches in any way interested in us helping to revitalize them. So we've gone to the grassroots of planting churches, very similar vein along with Paul, like in our neighborhoods. We're not looking to create big, location-driven establishment churches, partly because the way Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, even in our city that is ever growing and becoming more metropolis, because of immigration, we're still finding that they're driven by that kind of neighborhood, local feel. They want the intimacy. But we're trying to model a group of churches that will be like that, but truly be networked, care for each other. It's not a franchise. It's not a competition. Each church reflects the uniqueness of that particular neighborhood. So it's not a one size fits all. And I've been here now 10 years, believe it or not. In the last 5, we've started 4 church 4 churches. Now, ironically, the one that I have in Goose Bay is a replant or a revitalization. So we just take it as it comes, but the need for us is more church planting.
Yeah, I'm curious about the sort of the timeline and cost per unit. I know just in our conversations we've had you here, you've done some teaching and training for us on church planting, which we've really appreciated. The timeline and the depth that you guys are working at is impressive to me. So tell us a little bit about your approach. For example, I know you don't start a plant until you've got a planter and 2 interns. Mm-hmm. And so what's the cost per unit, and I realize that it's kind of crass language, but we have to make good decisions with the finances we have. What's the cost per unit, and then what's the sort of average timeline from seedling? You send out this little group to you're cutting cake, and that church is going independent, and you're wishing them well.
Yeah. So that's to kind of reverse engineer that. I was heavily influenced by a book years ago called Church in Hard Places that you both know about, Mez McConnell and Mike McKinley. And then that led me to a friendship with Mez and a guy named Matthew Spender Davidson. I still have nobody explain to me why we've got to call them all 3 of those things, but which led me over to Scotland, exposed me to their ministry called 20 Schemes. And in the context of my world, which is very Irish Catholic, Irish Anglican, I just found a lot of commonalities with what Mez was doing in what's called the Schemes of Scotland. The way they approached life, their ecclesiology in regards to the contextual kind of context of the people they're reaching, and found a lot of similarities. So in Newfoundland, there has been, 50 odd years in the modern area of trying to parachute people in church plant in the classic kind of American, Canadian, Baptist Republic model that, you get a guy, you bring him in, he's got piles of money, and hopefully in 36 months, up pops a church. And it has met with just tragic results of cynicism, betrayal, hurt, burnout, mean things said about the people trying to do the plant, to the way that my island and the people here were described as impossible to reach. So through all of that, I came to the conclusion, with a lot of help and counsel, a lot of prayer, that we were going to reach neighborhoods, that the way to reach people was I had to do my best, as best I could, to raise up Indigenous Newfoundlanders, have some sort of Newfoundland influence, which is the reason we started Mile One Mission, so that people knew this was a Newfoundland run thing. And we moved people in, lock, stock, and barrel, into a neighborhood. And honestly, our expectation, it takes 7 to 10 years to get a church of 50 people.
Unpack that for me. You move your planters in, right? Into the neighborhood. So they got to live in the neighborhood. And I would assume the purpose of that is so that the church can basically grow at the speed of evangelism. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And not only that, but honestly, unashamedly, our goal is that 95% plus of the people attending the church are from the neighborhood. They know each other, not just on the weekend. They do life together. And we put a high premium on our planting team, or our send team, for lack of, just words we use, to learn that neighborhood. What is the good, the bad, the ugly, the celebration part, the prayer part of that neighborhood? What's its strengths and weaknesses, and how to so whether that's the local schools, the businesses, whatever that might be in that particular neighborhood, the social issues, they will start to adopt and reflect the group they're living with. And
so let me press in on that too, because what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is really how a church is going to decide whether they're going to go with the sort of the church planting model or the revitalization model. And one of the issues is, I think you're right that to really church plant, you've got to move into the neighborhood. You got to get 2-3 people moved into the neighborhood to do that. How do you do that in a place like in Toronto? Like how do you do that in Toronto, where the housing prices are so high? So what are you doing? Is Mile One renting a house in a neighborhood to get this started? How are you moving your people into those neighborhoods?
So up to this point, we try to raise the money. I do. I'm a fundraiser. That's one of my gifts, I guess. And so we've been, really appealing to the broader Church of Canada, the United States, indeed around the world. So we can pay our planters and interns a livable wage, but none of them are getting, none of them have it easy, but it's a livable wage so they can afford. And we've had a donation. We've had a great set of donations. One denomination we work with actually purchased a home for us that has an upstairs and a basement apartment. And for 2 years, we can bring potential planters and interns, and they can live there almost rent free.
Yep.
And so far, those people we put in there have been wise stewards of that freedom to garner up down payments, plan financially, get out of debt, so that they can then move into neighborhoods and afford the living dynamic that they're in.
Yeah, don't feel any need to apologize for how expensive this is, because I want people to have the facts. And to be honest with you, if we're not willing to pay for it, then we don't believe in it. And the reality is both of these models are expensive. And I don't know that there is any way to grow the kingdom of God in Canada that's not going to be expensive, just given our context. Buying buildings is massively expensive. Renovating old buildings is massively expensive. Moving into these neighborhoods is massively expensive. So if you're looking for a cheap way to do, disciple making in Canada, I haven't heard it yet. So don't apologize for there being costs. I want people to know what they are. So you're buying a building, you're sticking your church planner and your interns in that building, and then they're doing neighborhood outreach, small groups, I'm assuming, local ministries.
Yeah, so they start off. So again, using language we use, we have our send team. Our send team is then responsible to try and meet everybody they can in that particular neighborhood, and by God's grace, discover what we would call a core team. There, Lord willing, there are Christians in that neighborhood. There are somebody that they can build relationship with, whatever. Then they start doing things, attending things, coaching things, whatever. But they open up their homes for meals and things like that. And then the next step after a consistent Bible study is we'd go to either event Sunday services, like we're building towards something, because it takes a while to find a place that you could rent, that people build that relationship and trust. Then we'll move to monthly services, bi-weekly services. And until we feel there's enough critical mass that we don't start, we don't embarrass ourselves, we don't get ourselves ahead, then we'll do weekly services. And for us, the marker of self-sufficient autonomy is two things. One, the core group can afford to pay the one pastor. They can afford the pastor and the basic overhead of that. And they have, for us, a plurality of leaders. Nice. There's more than just one fully biblically qualified leader. When they have a plurality of leaders and somewhat financial stability, then we will have that kind of celebration of their autonomous. And we all make a commitment, including Calvary Baptist, that if we ever get to one leader or less, we willingly will come underneath one of the other churches for help with leadership.
So you'll take them back. Is that
yes?
So okay.
Yeah.
So the finish line, just again for listeners, somebody's driving their car, weaving through traffic. I want to make sure they got the bottom line here. The finish line for you as a plant mission is three elected elders, because you said a plurality of leaders, and they've got a budget sufficient to cover the cost of a senior pastor. Yeah. And then you're going to have some kind of weaning off process where maybe you're still paying for those two interns for another 3 years. Right.
Yeah. The internship for us is a kind of another ministry. It's a burden of mine to create a greenhouse where we can constantly be raising up a generation, and a lot of them aren't going to stay in Newfoundland. So that's where I have a burden to help my country. Is I want guys like you and Paul to be able to call me.
So you consider us part of your country, right? It's not just the island.
Yes. when push comes to shove, yes.
Yeah, there was a lot of hesitation in that.
That's okay. That's okay. Toronto, Paul's Island is just Toronto, so it's all good. It's all good. All right. So just again to put a point on this, it sounds like, and you correct me if I'm wrong, your basic plan or your assumption starting this process is it's going to be 7 to 10 years, and it's probably going to be $250,000 to $300,000 a year per site.
To know quantified, believe it or not, it's around $130,000 to $145,000 a year per plant.
Okay.
It'll get larger, like as we get into like weekly services. There's a little bit more that goes with that. But I must say, I'm very proud of our guys. Now, remember, we would still live in one of the less expensive metropolitans to live in. Now that's going to quickly change over the next decade. Yep. And that's one of the reasons I'm as urgent as I am to get as much done as I can right now, because I think, some of the boom stuff and some of the forecasts of natural resource development is going to happen here, and it might actually start pricing us out of it. Now I've got a whole other set of opinions, which is a whole other podcast about how churches, organizations, and even wealthy people in our churches could actually help planting and revitalization and pipeline development. But that's a whole other discussion.
All right. Well, thank you. That was very helpful. Now, Paul, similar questions to you. When it comes to revitalization, what's your assumption? Obviously, it's assumptions God could bless and it could get done in less than half the time, or you could hit unusual delays. But what's your general assumption about the timeline, how long this is going to take from the start of the partnership to whatever the end is? How do you define the end, and what are the costs associated?
So very similar to what Stephen's doing. So in fact, it's interesting because as I'm listening to Steve, I'm thinking, yeah, a lot of what Steve's doing is just a little more formalized. I mean, he's got Mile One as an organization. So probably what I'm saying is more local church. Of course, Steve's working out of Calvary Baptist, but we don't have an organization. We're not doing this on a broader scale. We're doing it as just one local church in the city. That could be a helpful little delineation. We would say each revitalization is very different. So it depends what you're working with. So our denomination, we joined, and we were very upfront with that. Part of the reason we joined our denomination was to say, hey, you've got, over 40 church buildings in our city, many of which, not all of which, but there's a sizable number are in decline or struggling. And we all know there's a problem finding guys to put into pulpits. And so if we can raise up a guy here and send a bunch of our people who have been in a fairly healthy church for a length of time, who sort of know what church life can be, and plop them down there, well, that, I think, it just depends on what the situation is. So we've done it where we've paid for that pastor's salary for a couple of years after he went there. We've weaned him off over time. We've done it where we just send a guy and that church has to come up with it on their own. They have enough resources, they can do that. So it really, really depends on the church that's getting help. And in some measure, we call it revitalization, but really, I heard one pastor say this, I thought it was smart. It's like, it's just pastoring. Like, it's sheep without a shepherd that are in decline. And for some reason, and this is not at all true for what Stephen was describing about what he's doing, but I think we all know there's a bit of the sexy in church planting, and that, and then it leads to this kind of thing like, well, we've planted 10 churches in the city. Well, those churches might be 2 or 3 people each.
Yeah,
that's right. They're not well covenanted. They don't have a good structure. They're like, there's all kinds of things, and they don't last. Yeah, and so there's not much tracking on who lasts more than 5 years. What Stephen said about the island, I would say in Toronto, I could give you a long list of literally millions of dollars spent in church planting in this city that was all burned up and gone and nothing to show for it. Yeah. But I could give you another list of the churches that are getting strengthened, revitalized, local churches here that are sending guys out to places. It's not just us who's doing it. So I don't know. For us, you say like it's $100,000 at least to live in the city as an employed, all in health benefits, everything. If you want somebody to actually live in the city and work in the city, that's kind of bare minimum now. It sounds ridiculous to me based on what I used to make 25 years ago, but it's just the facts of life right now. And so, yeah, I can't remember your question now, Paul. I was starting to ramble. I hate rambling. Go ahead.
No, that's great. I'm interested in timeline and cost, and then my next question is going to be challenges. Like, what are the unique challenges of revitalization? Because you said that church planting has a reputation of sort of being sexy. It's what every young guy at a seminary wants to do. He wants to be a church planter, and again, lots has changed. 30 years ago, when I was starting out in ministry, kind of everybody started as a youth pastor, unless you could sing and play the guitar, in which case you might get to be the worship pastor. But you started out either strumming a guitar or, drinking Pepsi through a sock. And that's how you cut your teeth. But now all of a sudden it's church planting. And so everybody wants to be a church planter. Some of that is just because, as you say, there's a need, and it's the great adventure. It's jumping into the deep end. It's the big thing. But I wonder if church revitalization, maybe because it isn't quite as sexy, it's just because it looks so complicated. And instead of dealing with energetic young people moving into a neighborhood, you're often dealing with older folks who are very set in their ways. And dear Aunt Mildred, who wants to die clutching at the organ, and you're just thinking, I don't need this. What are the costs? What are the psychological costs? What are the unique challenges of church revitalization?
So I think some of the things you're identifying are really good questions for aspiring ministers to ask.
Right.
And that's on the level of heart motivation. And so when we say church planting can be sexy, what we could mean by that is I can get all my preferences. And that's a very selfish and arrogant way to shepherd God's people. And you and I, Stephen, we all know that as shepherds of the sheep, you take, what Peter said, the ones allotted to you.
Mm-hmm.
You take them and you care for them and you love them, and some of them bite and kick and scream, and that's okay. You're the shepherd. You take care of them. So I think when you go into, church planting or revitalizing, one of the revitalizers, one of the churches we helped sort of on the sly, the brother who was revitalizing that work, which was really in tough shape when he went there, but they had a man in the church, 100 years old, who would stand up and sing the doxology at the end of every service. Now that doesn't really fly in our modern, hip kind of thing, but that brother the pastor there, he just honored that man, and he did that till he died, until he was 105 or something. He was old. And the young people that came to that church loved that man. I loved him. He was a godly saint, and it was quirky and weird as far as things that happen in a worship service. So I think the Lord has things to do in the pastor's heart, who goes to revitalize, about dying to some of those preferences and learning to love the people that God has given you, and then seeing how the Lord's going to do things in the other people's hearts, who you get to shepherd them and say, no, we're going to love Bob when he sings that doxology, and we're going to learn to learn from him. So there are tons of costs. And so I think, Stephen, it'd be interesting to hear your response to this too. Like when we planted Grace Fellowship Church, Susan and I had just been reading George Mueller's autobiography, where he says, I built the orphanages not for the orphans. Ultimately, I built the orphanages so that God's people would see that God answers prayer. Mm-hmm. That was foundational to Grace Fellowship Church. So we're celebrating our 25th year, and I'm bringing that story up all the time now, because we didn't know. There were 6 of us when we started, and we didn't have a really tight program. We started meeting right away on Sunday mornings. I preached just like it was to a room of 500 people. It was in a little basement where the top of my head scraped the ceiling. And we did that for about a year. And then we moved to another place and to another. And I think we often, I'm sure you've heard the adage, you overestimate what you can do in a year and underestimate what the Lord could do in 5.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And so just that slow, steady, hold on to the things that God has revealed. So you're going to go revitalize a church, preach his word, pray, like actually pray, love the people that are there, get good membership, good ecclesiology in place, and then just carry on. You get to one end of the road, turn around and, put your, whatever that device is when you're farming, you go from one end to the other. So I think that's the best way to revitalize. Just be faithful and do the things the Lord calls us to do.
Well, as I mentioned at the start, my end goal for this conversation is to actually help a church, wherever it may be in Canada, to decide which of these models is best for them. It's probably an overstatement to say that you hear we get a lot of resources, a lot of encouragement regarding church planting out of the U.S. That seems to be kind of the preferred tool. And then recently, I've been hearing a lot about church revitalization out of Australia. We had that fantastic presentation up at the Pipeline Symposium at NBC from City to City, Australia, and they have really, it seems like, got this down to a science. And so I'm wondering, why is church planting the preferred tool in America? What is it about that American context that seems to foreground the church planting tool? What is it about Australia that seems to foreground the revitalization tool? and then which of those tools is going to be better in a particular context here in Canada. So I would ask you both this. We'll pop over to Stephen, because you said you're doing one revitalizing work, and you're doing some planting, but both of you can just pop in and out of this part of the conversation. Tell me how you decide. Paul, you've mentioned too that you've done both. So how do you decide when to foreground the revitalization tool and when to foreground the planting tool?
Yeah. So, and I know Stephen would agree with this as well. I maybe have a bit of an aversion to, he may not agree with this part. He'll agree with the prayer part. I maybe have a bit of an aversion to sort of formal structures and, if you follow these steps and sort of a rigid plan. So even some of the stuff we heard from City to City, great. I don't know how adaptable it would be in our world, but I believe strongly in prayer. And so in 2015, we started praying that we could plant or revitalize 2 churches by the year 2020. We didn't have a planter, we didn't have money, we didn't have any churches in mind to revitalize. We didn't know if we were going to do 2 plants, 2 revitalizations, or a combination. So we just prayed as a church. We prayed every single week that we would be able to do that. And then eventually the Lord brought us a guy. And then when all of a sudden we hear about a church down the road that's thinking about selling for $10 million their property, and I write them a letter. It's just a letter pleading with them not to give it up, but let us send. And so we send that guy in there. We pay for his salary for a year. So you test him out for a year, and then you vote on him. They vote on him. They take him. Once he's there, we start sending our people over. I couldn't have predicted any of that. And that was very different than the last revitalization we did. But I feel like the Lord is in the both of them. So I just want to say off the bat, I think if you're if you're a church in Northern Ontario and you're busting at the seams and you're looking at a community nearby, just begin actually with praying and asking the Lord to make those connections. And if you have the kind of willingness to say, oh, the sovereign God of ours has perhaps connected me in this path, and this is the direction we're going to go, and you explore that. And like the Apostle Paul, somehow the Holy Spirit says, don't go there. And so then you swing over here. The Lord, it's a joy to live through all of that stuff and just to see what the Lord would do. So I always want to challenge pastors, just begin with prayer and then try stuff and talk to people and see what happens. So we've had lots of failures along the way. I mean, no plants that have, been established and then crashed, not that kind of failure, but failures on the front end of looking where to do and how to do it and who to do it with.
That's good to hear. I think sometimes maybe we try to overplan, and we have this 5-year plan, and we're going to have this many churches planted or revitalized, and so we need to do this, we need to do that. And ministry is not like that. A lot of things change in the ground, and there are a lot of subjective realities that you can only see in the spiritual realm, and you have to wait for God to move. So that's a good
it would be pretty presumptuous of us to say that we know what his plan is, right?
It would be. If only there were like a verse or 7 about that. Anyway.
Yeah.
Stephen, how about yourself? How do you, as you're coming into a community, you're looking at, is it Goose Bay where you're doing the revitalization?
Yeah. It's up in Labrador.
So
and when I say that, it's a revitalization in the sense that there was a building.
Yeah.
I mean, it was literally down to 2 couples, but God had to move that those 2 couples reached out to us. They had a limited connection to Calvary, had heard about Calvary's Mile 1 mission and reached out to us. And now we have a guy up there, and they had 27 people at church on Sunday after a year of services. And again, several things as I listen to Paul, I think that for our audience is also understand, we always think in terms of one size fits all. Some Christian pastor does something, he writes a book, and then he says, if you take my 6 principles and you take it anywhere, you can pop up this or do that. The reality is, even with the 3 of us, we are very good friends. We do a lot of life and ministry together, but we're very different people. God has given me a passion. I tend to know how to cast vision and raise money. I'm not afraid to call people. I'm fearless to get.
That's very true.
I received one of those calls last week.
I'm willing to get 100 no's to get 1 yes. Not everybody's like that, and so pastors, when they're looking at that, can say, they'll look at me and go, well, if you're not Steve Bray, then that means you can't do this. And some other guys in Ontario, well, if I'm not Paul Martin and I don't have this and I don't have that, then no, you've got to, God says that he gifts us all differently. Not everybody was Paul, not everybody was Peter. I'm preaching through the book of Acts. The first martyr wasn't even an apostle. It was a proto deacon at best. And so I think that's a big part of it. I try to use my gifts and talents where I'm at. I think we don't understand the power of context. I don't think again, I'll give you an example. I had a very well-meaning pastor in Cambridge, Ontario, call me up, want to do a big conference, get a bunch of people in, have me explain mile one mission for Cambridge, Kitchener, Waterloo. And I quietly declined. I just like, dude, I haven't got a clue how to plant a church in your world. And I have no idea if the things that I'm doing here in St. John's would work in your world.
Yeah.
You need to pray with these brothers you want to gather together, go through the word of God, study out the lay of your land, and figure out what God would lay on your heart. If you want me to come just encourage you, lead some times of prayer, get into the word of God, fine, but I don't have some magic formula for how to reach parts of Ontario. I can tell you when I travel Vancouver, my head hurts when I think about how would you reach this people?
Yeah.
The costs, the segregated cultures, the just the enormity of the complexities of it just simply make my head spin at times. And
well, that's a good
I
point.
think we lose sight of that.
One of the challenges I think we have in Canada, this is the Canadian Pastors Forum, is that we are our regions are so distinct, so disconnected, and there's not a lot that you can pick up from Toronto and drop into Canmore. We're just too different. Like, so you're on an island that has a couple of population centers and then a lot of big open space. Paul's in one of the most densely packed urban areas in North America.
Right.
And then I'm in another place where, we're a regional center at sort of the gateway to central and northern Ontario. We're a small city surrounded by a lot of very small villages. And so it's very, very different. And everybody's economic situation is different. Right. You were talking about, you've got opportunities to move people into neighborhoods that, I don't know if Paul has. And I'm probably somewhere between the two of you because the GTA prices are coming north to where we are because of remote work. And so we're dealing with some of those realities, having to pay people in Aurelia what Paul's paying them in Toronto, because the housing prices are so similar. It's a very unique reality. And I think we're at the place where there's just not a model. There's no such thing as a Canadian model for anything. Everything is going to have to be adapted. So, are there any principles that we can look at that could be, wisely and prayerfully applied in these various contexts that would help churches wrestle through the should we plant or should we revitalize? Anything you want to offer as a principle?
Yeah. So again, when I look at the book of Acts, it's funny to me. The book of Acts almost is all church planting in the beginning. And by the time you get
they couldn't
to the
do revitalization, could they?
Well, no, but by the time you get to the end, you're into some revitalization. But what Paul mentioned earlier, I mean, First and Second Timothy, Titus is basically Paul sending proteges in, guys that he has discipled into existing churches with a mandate of how to shepherd said churches. I mean, the 7 churches of Revelation, you could say 5 of the 7 are kind of revitalization layouts. Like, this is what the problem is. You need to get your house in order. You need this to change. You need that to change.
True. Well, even in the New Testament, you can trace sediment in Ephesus, right? Like you can say, well,
absolutely,
it was founded here, and
right.
At the end, it's under John, and you can see these layers in between the Timothy layer, et cetera. Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think key thing where I'm at, there are very few evangelical churches. There are even fewer buildings. There's not an appetite amongst the religious establishment to reach out or coexist with quote unquote evangelicals, that kind of stuff.
Stephen, let's just highlight that so people can hear that. So one of the differences between your context and Paul's context is most of the churches on your island are Catholic or
Yes.
Anglican,
Yes.
who
Or United.
probably
Yeah.
look at you as a cultist, I would think.
They do. Irony
Yeah,
of ironies, Roman Catholics actually see me better, but then now they'll never sell me a building. Having said that, they did sell me a
you're in
Yeah,
one.
building.
what are you talking about?
But what I'm
Never say
saying
never.
is, I'm not in your world where there's 40 or 60 evangelical churches that are dying, or people are looking at making a quick buck to an investor that's going to turn it into 100 condos, where you
Yeah.
guys could go. If I was there with my personality, I would probably be knocking on more doors. That's my DNA. I would probably have a completely different understanding of revitalization and planting, where my priorities would be, all that kind of stuff, if I was in the GTA versus being in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Yeah, where Paul is in Toronto, there are, as you said, 30 or 40 or however many you mentioned, basically Baptist churches. So brother and sisters that you can go to and say, hey, here's a plan, and there's you got the same blood type, so to speak, spiritually. So you can make that transfer. It would be definitely trickier to have that conversation with a Roman Catholic parish or an Anglican parish for sure. So those are some considerations. Economic considerations are obviously a factor. Any other considerations you'd encourage pastors and churches to be thinking through?
I would throw in there, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God.
Mm-hmm.
So there's it's okay to fail, and
right.
And failure is not yeah, we don't understand how much we've adopted our own culture, our culture broadly, the Western culture of,
That's right.
everything has to be successful.
Right.
Everything has to look a certain way. It's not a real church unless you have, elaborate bathrooms or something ridiculous.
And how fast
church,
everything has to happen. Like,
Right.
what's wrong with something taking 10 years?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think as people learn to pray and to truly pray about things, and then look for how the Lord may answer, and then are willing to take risks, and risk often involves losing money, but we're not talking about folly here, about just throwing money after the wind. We're talking about attempting things, and then being attentive to how the Lord is leading, and really living under the sovereign hand of God, that he is able to direct us in particular ways. So Stephen's been talking about the book of Acts. I mean, that's all through Acts, right?
That's right.
Of the Lord opening, closing doors. Well, John Baird said, I stood at the door of Providence and waited for your direction, something like that. But it wasn't until I stepped forward in faith that the door opened for me. So I think sometimes Calvinists can get a little bit lazy and think that, God is sovereign. He's got to plant the churches. No, he's told us to do it, and we need to get ourselves in gear and get going.
That's right.
And then I would just throw out there John 12, near the end of his ministry, where Jesus said, unless the seed falls into the ground, it and dies, it bears no fruit.
Right.
And so Grace Fellowship Church has had to die multiple times. I weep generally when we send 30 people away. I love those people. I've invested in their lives.
You send your best people, right? And you send your best young leaders. Yeah. It took me 2 years to get over just the emotional and psychological impact of our first plant. Like, it's a lot of my best friends, a lot of our best young leaders. You're like, how are we ever going to recover from this? And then by God's grace, we did.
Yeah. And it's surprising what the Lord does. When we planted out on the east side of the city, we sent about 30 people, and a pastor and a couple deacons. And I'm not joking. Within 2 weeks, the Lord had brought 30 new people, and then it stopped. It was just like a direct replacement. Yeah. I'm not promising that's going to happen in every case. It was bizarre to us. We were not expecting it, but we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't tried, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think you just do things and see what the Lord will do.
The other thing, Paul, I throw in there is that we forget. We always rewrite history. Paul's been great to quote some guys. And again, another one that I always get fascinated is Adoniram Judson. And we make these guys studs, and we're so far removed, but we don't really actually go back and read about their lives. This guy goes into Burma, sees that massive statue, prays, and says, I know that the Lord wants me here, and eventually he's going to do a work here, and the God of the Bible is going to unseat you. And then he goes through 15 years, maybe a half a dozen converts, buries multiple wives and children, spends time arrested. And I say to my guys all the time, show me how in the modern Western church an Adoniram Judson could be successful today.
Yeah.
If that was, to go and have all kinds of support. And then, because sometimes it's generational. I tell my guys all the time, you may go into some of these neighborhoods and your job is to do nothing but till ground. And it'll be someone after you that will actually get a harvest. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't make you a failure. That, we love to quote, I planted and someone watered, but only God gives the increase. But we always think, no, I'm the guy that's going to get the increase part. Yeah. And I think that's part of our problem is we are so success driven, which makes us very aggressive on the front end and then very embarrassed in the middle and back end when we're trying to ask people for help or for prayer because we feel like I didn't pull it off and now you don't think I'm good at what I do and all that kind of stuff. And somehow corporate Canada, America got into the church in regards to all of our missional attempts.
If you're listening to this podcast right now somewhere, I would encourage you to rewind the last 2 minutes and re-listen to what Stephen just said.
Yeah, the whole fundraising model for, does introduce pressures and incentives that distort reality and that play to our insecurities and our foibles and frailties as sinners. So yeah, that's a very good word. And it's a reminder that I think any church that wants to do, as Paul said, attempt great things for God, and any church that wants to do that has to commit to the long haul and can't be, plucking the seedling out of the pot every 6 months to wonder why it's not growing faster. Like just stick it in there, water it and fertilize it for the long haul and see what the Lord does. Yeah.
Hey, 2 great books a guy could read. One, I can't recall the author's name and I apologize for that, but it's the biography of Anne Judson, who was Adoniram Judson's first wife. Yeah. That will give you a great view of what it can cost to do the work of the ministry. And the second is an old one by Banner of Truth called 5 Pioneer Missionaries. And in particular, if you can read the case of Henry Martin, who went into different spelling of Martin, so I'm not, no relation, but Henry Martin went into parts of what would be modern day Turkey and, died in his view a failure, but was greatly used of God. So the thing Stephen was saying earlier, there's a couple books you could read that will give you lots of stories of that kind of thing.
That's good. Very good.
I would also add on local level, Ordinary Pastor by D.A. Carson.
Yeah.
If you want to read about a Canadian guy who just served God faithfully and thought he was a failure, and yet look at the way God has used generationally in the Carson family.
Yeah, good. Well, this has been very helpful. My goal, again, for this conversation was just to equip pastors and churches to take a both-and approach, or to at least have a both-and mentality when thinking about how to see the Lord's work increase in their community. Maybe the church planting is the right approach. It may be that revitalization. It may be that they can do both in the same community in different churches and different situations. So that's been very, very helpful. And I want to thank you both for your contributions and for being on the program today. It has been greatly appreciated.
Been enjoyed, brother.
That's all the time that we have for this week. We will be back, hopefully, God willing, again for another conversation about things that matter to the Canadian church. Until then, take care and God bless.